Okay, so it's 1 o'clock, and welcome everybody. Welcome to the Institute of Health and Wellbeing Maurice Bloch annual lecture series. My name is Robin Dunbar. I am from MRC CSO Social and Public Health Unit, and I'm incredibly honored to present today's guest, Professor Robin Dunbar. While we are waiting slowly for others to join, I will say a few words. So Robin Dunbar is Professor Emeritus of Evolutionary Psychology, Head of Social and Evolutionary Neuroscience Research Group in the Department of Experimental Psychology at University of Oxford. Let me tell you just shortly about his research. So Professor Dunbar's research work is focused on behavioral, cognitive, and neuroendocrinological mechanisms that underpin social bonding in primates and humans, with the aim to understand the mechanisms and the functions that relationships serve and provide us with insights on many relevant issues, from creation of large-scale societies to individual health. Being a truly interdisciplinary researcher scientist, Professor Dunbar is an anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist and a specialist in primate behavior. And in his research, he has used a multitude of different approaches relevant for many disciplines, such as conventional behavioral and cognitive experimental approaches, combined with network analysis, agent-based modeling, comparative studies of primate brain evolution, neuroimaging, and neuroendocrinology. Now, he's widely known for his research on social networks that highlighted the constraints time places on individuals' ability to manage their relationships, from where the popular notion of Dunbar's number comes from. During his extremely productive academic career, he has published in many influential scientific journals across disciplines, and written or co-authored books on topics such as human reproductive decisions, evolution of culture and language, gossip, and human evolution. His most recent book, Friends, Understanding the Power of Our Most Important Relationships, summarizes in a very approachable manner, not only for academics, the most relevant research on mechanisms and importance of different kinds of relationships for many individual outcomes, including health. So today's talk will be about friendship and health. And before I give the stage to Professor Dunbar, let me just let you know that if you have questions, please feel free to write them in the chat, and we will address them at the end of the talk. So let's give welcome to Professor Dunbar.
Thank you very much, Sarenka. I'll just share my screen. And we can get started. Okay, so I have a very checkered background, as you may have gathered, that I actually come from a humanities background, if anything. In fact, I first started as a philosopher, but I got seduced by psychology into being a scientist. And so a lot of my work is crossover between psychology and zoology and evolutionary biology, I guess. Today I'm going to talk about the nature of friendship as much as anything else and how we create our friendships, but also in the context of the impact that friendships have, particularly for health in a very general sense. So if you like, I'm going to talk about two things really. One is why we have friends, what friends do for us, in other words, and secondarily, how we create these friendships to achieve those ends. So I'm going to make 4 key points, I think. One is that friendships have turned out to have a massive effect on our health and well-being, much, much more than I think anybody ever anticipated. And I kind of might just add that we've only known about this effect for the last 15 years, maybe, but it seems that friendships, well, in that 15 years, there's been an extraordinary tsunami of epidemiological studies showing that the number and quality of close friendships you have is the single best predictor of your psychological health and well-being, your physical health and well-being, and even your longevity into the future, how long you're going to live from now. So it's a hugely massive effect. In the context of that, the human social world is extremely small scale, much more small scale, I think, than we ever really assumed it was. That these constraints on our social world are partly cognitive and partly a consequence of time, therefore of the way we build and maintain friendships. And the mechanism that allows us to create and maintain friendships is what psychologists would call a dual process mechanism. That's to say there are two different mechanisms working in tandem in using different brain networks, basically. But the key component of that is the endorphin system. The endorphin system is part of our pain management system in the brain, but endorphins, these little neuropeptides, play an extraordinary role in a number of different features, but one of which is managing friendships, essentially. But let me start with some of the evidence of just how important friendships are to your health. Here's one study. It's a meta-analysis of nearly 150 epidemiological studies, essentially of heart attack patients. So it's a survey of 300,000 people, basically. It's a prospective study. So the question they're asking is, what factors best predict your chances of surviving for 12 months after your first heart attack? So it's a very hard-nosed outcome measure. You either survive or you don't. You either have a second heart attack or you don't. But the consensus out of all this, these studies, really is very striking, and that is that the number and quality of friendships is the single most important factor. So on the left-hand side here is the effect size. It's effectively the magnitude of the effect of these different variables on this probability of surviving that first heart attack. And you can see network quality, which is a sort of composite of both quantity, number of friends, and quality of friends, comes way ahead of everything else, except giving up smoking. But all the other things which your friendly neighborhood doctor worries about on your behalf, how much activity you take, how much alcohol you consume, how obese you are, what drugs you're on, the quality of the air in the vicinity of where you live, what your diet's like, all these other things kind of pale into insignificance. They're not irrelevant, and I'm sure your friendly neighborhood doctor is very wise to worry about these things, but actually the most important thing is simply the quality and quantity of friends that you have. And aside from this huge quantity of evidence now for humans, we've begun to pick up similar signals from studies of many species of mammals that live in complex social systems. So baboons and chimpanzees among the primates in particular, wild horse populations in New Zealand, for example, and even dolphins show similar effects, that the number and quality of friendships that females have in particular, which is where the focus of the have direct fitness benefits. The animals recover faster from injuries, they live longer, they're more fertile, their offspring are more likely to survive and make it through to adulthood if they have if they're well embedded into a social network of friends, and that means grooming each other as the main mechanism in primates for creating friendships. I'll come back to that in a bit. Here's a very large scale, which we published last year, collaborators in Denmark, which was a 2-year follow-up study from one of the EU databases. So there's a large number of subjects, nearly 40,000 from 13 European countries. So everybody's aged 50 plus at the start of the sample, if you like, the first sample. And then the question is, or the question that's being asked is, how do the number of close friends you have or the number of voluntary activities you take part in? So, these are things like, I don't know, helping out with the Scouts, helping out with perhaps a political organization in your area, helping out with your local church, maybe all those kind of voluntary activities, helping out with charity shops, these kinds of things. How well do they predict both your perceived quality of life and also whether or not you are more likely to have symptoms of depression 2 years later? So it's a prospective study. And these are the main results, that the quality of life is an inverted U-shaped function of a conjoint measure of the number of friends you have, so this is close friends, and the amount of volunteering, the number of volunteering activities you do. You can see here, there's a peak somewhere in here at a conjoint value of about 15-ish. And if you look at depression symptoms, you see the reverse, that you're least likely to have symptoms of depression in the future if your combined friendship and volunteering index is about 15 again. And what that turns out to reflect is that the number of friends, the optimum number of friends you can have is 5, and the optimum number of volunteering activities you can have is 3. You can kind of trade these off against each other, but if you try and have too many friends and do too much volunteering, then you pay a price for it. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that your time is just split between too many different activities, and you don't have time to build up close relationships with the people involved. And I think the volunteering is kind of interesting because in most of these cases, what's obviously interesting or characteristic of these volunteering activities is they are social. People talk to each other, chat about themselves and their lives and so on during the course of doing these various activities. And I think it's that component, it's that opportunity to meet and talk to people that volunteering activities are giving you that is having this sort of beneficial effect. But there's a very clear message here from these data. If you try and do too much, you spread yourself too thinly and you don't benefit. Here's some more data. This is one of altogether 3 very large surveys. This is a national stratified UK sample carried out by one of the polling agencies for us, in which we were trying to look at social eating. So it was done with the Big Lunch organization, which you may well have heard of, to try and see what the benefits of eating together were. And so up here on the top left is the amount of social eating you do. This is actually, the measure here is how often you eat with other people for your evening meal, which was a much stronger effect than your midday meal. The number of close friends you had, and then self-ratings of a number of things: life satisfaction with life, how happy you felt yesterday, how worthwhile you felt your life is, how trusting you were of the community in which you lived, and how engaged you were with the local community. And actually somewhere in there was also how depressed you felt yesterday as the specific measure, but I've not actually put that in here. But the basic story here is, if you look at the structure of the causal relationships involved among the various possible combinations, that social eating has a very strong effect on the number of friends you have, and the number of friends you have, of course, has a very strong effect on how often you eat socially. So it's a bi-directional relationship, but these between them then affect all these other variables. And not only is happiness kind of important in that context, clearly, but also I think it's these 2 down here. It's the level of trust that you actually feel you have in the community of strangers, essentially, beyond your friendship circles, turns out to be heavily influenced by whether or not you have a number of close friends with whom you socialize on a regular basis. So very strong effects and very widespread. These effects trickle right the way through the whole of our social lives. So you might ask, the Danish study notwithstanding, whether you should have an infinite number of friends that, given these effects, maybe the more friends you can have, the better. The answer is we simply don't. The size of our social circles or our social networks, if you like, are very circumscribed. Here are data from about 6 million subscribers altogether from one very large European country. So this is the entire telephone database for one phone company in this country. So it's a very large sample. It's the number of calls made over the entire year. And what we've got plotted here is the distribution of the number of people that were called on a not terribly necessarily regular basis, but the criterion was that it should have called that number once and have been called back by that number at some point. And that was all. So it's kind of existing relationship, and we've removed all the 0800 numbers and all those that are obviously commercial numbers rather than personal numbers from the data set. But this yellow smear here, which is all the individuals in the sample, you can see peaks very strongly up here somewhere between about 100 and 100 and 200. Actually, the average here is about 145, I think, for these particular data. And we pick that number up all over the place, and you start looking for it, or when you're sort of cued in to look for it, it turns up in all sorts of places. So just for example, this is the top right here is the average size of weddings in the USA over the last decade. There's a database you can go to that gives you these data. The average number of guests at weddings is about 145. If you look at the size of hunter-gatherer society clans, so these are tribal people, if you like, who are living in the kinds of social systems in which we as a species have evolved and spent something like 99.9% of our evolutionary history, these small dispersed societies, then the size of their clans or local communities comes out at about 155. So again, very close to 150. Down here at the bottom, there's some very nice Italian data that cover about 7 centuries, I think it is, for alpine community sizes. The grazing associations, essentially villages in the Alps in Italy, and they start in the medieval times and they go right the way through to the 19th century, where all this data is recorded and has been recorded because it's all about who has rights to graze their goats and sheep and so on in the village pastures. That gives us a mean group size of about 160 across that time, despite the fact the population is increasing steadily through that time. And the other source of data is the Doomsday Book, which, as you may well remember, was the first complete national census of England and Wales by the Normans, by William the Conqueror, when he conquered England, or took the crown of England in 1066. So 1087, they did a complete survey of everything, every plough, every fireplace, every cow, every horse, every field throughout the whole of England. And the historical demographers have worked out that the average size of villages was almost exactly 150 during that period. And then last but not least up here, if you look at the size of all modern armies, or the structure of all modern armies, the size of the company, which is this smallest unit that can stand on its own 2 feet as an independent fighting unit, and is very much regarded as family within the army, that has across the world an average size of about 180. It varies from about 120 to about 200. I think the British Army is 120, typically the American Army is pushing 200. But everybody is sort of clustered around in that sort of figure around about 150. So this figure of 150 seems to be very common. Now, what this defines is really all the people with whom you have some sort of reciprocated relationship. They're the people you would contact probably once a year, even if only by a Christmas card. And in fact, one of our sources of data, exactly that, this was done in the days when people were still sending Christmas cards. We asked a whole lot of people to tell us how many people were in the households they were sending cards to, and the answer was very close to 150. So and I should add that this was not, this figure was actually predicted originally off the back of a relationship between social group size and brain size in primates. So it wasn't an empirically determined value, if you like. It was predicted from some sort of theory, if you will. But there's turned out to be huge quantities of empirical evidence for it. And that's the number now known as Dunbar's number. So the obvious question you might ask at this point is whether the digital social media haven't changed this and made it possible to have many more friends and contacts. And the answer, because that's what, if you like, Facebook promised us when they came on stream. And the answer appears to be no. These are actually a distribution of the number of friends on 1 million Facebook pages. From Stephen Wolfram's analyses. He does a lot of analyses of Facebook data for Facebook and on his own account. Facebook allows you to have up to 5,000 friends on Facebook, and you can see there's a tiny little yellow blip there, but these are mostly professional users. If you look at sort of ordinary people, if you like, then the distribution is very strongly skewed to somewhere between, Wolfram gives a figure of about 100 to 250-ish, but it's clearly very tightly skewed somewhere around about 150. And in fact, subsequently to this I think was done about 2009. In about 2012, an analysis was published of 61 million Facebook pages, so totting up the number of friends that the Facebook page owners had on their page, and the average is exactly 149, so you couldn't be closer, really. So it looks like Facebook hasn't really changed things. There are a few people that have 1,000 friends on Facebook or so, but in the grand scheme of things, it's quite modest. And as you'll see in a minute, really all these people are adding people or doing what we do in everyday life, and that's including acquaintances in addition to their friends. So what I sometimes describe as the voyeurs looking in on their breakfast photographs rather than being real friends. Now it turns out from, I think we're probably running at about 20 neuroimaging studies now that have looked at the size of personal social networks measured in various ways, either by asking people to list out the number of friends they have or using their Facebook pages to do that, and the size of core bits of the brain. And all of these point to a huge network of neural tissue that seems to underpin the size of your friendship circle. So across individuals, the bigger the volume of these neural elements, as it were, the more friends people have. And up here on the left, I've kind of sketched out where these are. It involves the prefrontal cortex largely, particularly this area down here, the orbital frontal cortex and the medial frontal cortex up here. And there's huge, thick cabling that goes through to the temporal parietal junction up here, and then down the temporal lobe to the temporal pole in particular. So this huge, massive neural networks, used to be known as the mentalizing networks, turned out to be virtually identical to what was already known as the default mode network. And then adding into that this second loop down here, which runs into the limbic system, buried underneath the surface of the brain, as it were, coming from the orbital frontal cortex in particular, but also tapping into the wiring up here. So this massive component of the brain that seems to be devoted primarily to managing our social networks. And in fact, it turns out now neuroimaging studies have been done of two species of old world monkeys, macaques and baboons, and we see exactly the same regions correlating with the size of their social networks, essentially. This social network, the default mode network, also turns out to be key to doing things like mentalizing, understanding other people's intentions, the capacity to inhibit behavior, particularly this area up here, causal attribution, a whole bunch of metacognitive abilities that turn out to be unique to the anthropoid primates, the monkeys and apes. Other species of birds and mammals don't have these cognitive capacities. They don't. What it's kind of doing is allowing them to reflect on the way they see the world and to make inferences about how the world is working. So one of those is one-trial learning, which is something that only primates can do. That's because essentially what they're doing is formulating hypotheses based on the evidence they see, whereas most other mammals and birds engage in associative learning. They just tot up the number of cases. So if you like, monkeys and apes, and obviously humans do science, they make inferences and build theories and hypotheses, and everybody else just does rote learning, basically. Okay, so there's a lot of kind of empirical neurological evidence to support this claim that this cognitive constraint is imposed by the size of your brain really limits the size of your social network. So if you look at that network of 150 and your contacts with those, how often you meet them, speak to them, post to them, whatever, your social network doesn't look like this picture on the left from some music festival somewhere or other, as a kind of amorphous gathering of strangers. It looks something much more like this picture on the bottom. It's very clumpy, divided into subgroups who receive differing amounts of attention from you. And if you look at these kind of data, the picture you get of human social networks looks something like this. You're sitting in the center, and you're surrounded by a series of layers of increasing size. But I should make it clear that these layers are what we might think of as hierarchically inclusive. So each layer includes the layers inside it. So the 15 here is not an extra 15 people, it's an extra 10 people to make up 15 in addition to the 5 people in the layer inside. But you have these series of layers which are very, very consistent in size. Obviously, I should say there's variation around these things. These are just population averages, as indeed the Dunbar's number is just a population average. That the quality, the emotional quality of the relationships declines as you go out down through the circles, and the frequency with which you contact the people declines as you go down through the circles. So your 150 friends here, defined by the red line, really is broken up into 4 sub-layers underneath, a layer at a 50, within that a core 15, within that a core 5, and finally, right in the center of it, 1.5 inner layer of intimate friends, if you like, obviously romantic related partners. But we also know that beyond the 150, there are at least 2 more layers, in fact, probably 3, one out at about 500, one at 1500, and then a final layer at 5000. Now, we can kind of put names on these to say, kind of characterize what the quality of those relationships are. The red line is really your definitive social circle, your social network. It kind of defines who you would be altruistic for. If they ask you to do you a favor, do them a favor, you kind of agree, you wouldn't really hesitate about that, and you wouldn't expect a return. But once you cross over the red line, you kind of look for some guarantee that they'll pay you back in the future. That's how it seems. It becomes much more of a trading economic relationship. But outside the 150 is this layer of acquaintances, which I think is very commonly added on to Facebook pages. So these are people that you know vaguely, and you work with a lot of these people. You perhaps include the barista you used to get your latte from on the way to work every morning, that you have a chat with, maybe about this, that, or the other, or the weather. So you know them quite well, but these are people you kind of wouldn't invite back to your big party. So one definition we've taken to using for that 150 is really your kind of bar mitzvah, marriage, and funeral events, as it were. These are all the people who feel a sense of obligation, so on, to where they turn up to those big once-in-a-lifetime events. And then after that, people become increasingly anonymous. So the 1500 appears to be related to the number of faces you can put names to. You don't really have a relationship with these people. They certainly probably don't even know who you are, but you can recognize them. And then beyond that, this layer at 5,000 was identified by some psychophysicists a couple of years ago who showed that that corresponded to the number of faces you would know whether or not you've seen them before. So you don't know who they are, but you know whether they're complete strangers, or whether you know who they are. Then sort of running across that is the difference between family and friends. So this 150 layer really consists of both extended family and friends. And roughly in modern post-demographic transition societies, that's 50-50. Interestingly enough, our data show very nicely that people who come from very large families actually have fewer friends, because their time is taken up with dealing with their extended family members, and they kind of don't have any slots, so many slots free for friends. But on average, with our sort of 1.8 children that we have now, then it's a 50-50 split. And just to give you a sense of the scale of how much time we devote to these people, these are data from one of our data sets. It's actually a data set of women's only social networks, half from the UK, half from Belgium. And it's plotting the frequency or the rate of contact per day for each person in each of these circles as a function of the circles down here. So it's running the 5 circle here, 15, 50, 150, and out to the 500 circle, the circle of acquaintances. And you can see that a huge amount of contact is devoted to these 5 people in that, in a core of close friends. We sometimes call them the shoulders to cry on friends, because that's primarily their function. And it drops off very rapidly. In fact, it turns out then that about 40% of your total social time, and indeed your emotional capital, is given to these 5 people in this central circle. And then another 20% is given to the extra 10 people in this circle. So these 15 people get 60% of your total social effort. And somebody out here in the 100 outer layers of the 150 circle probably gets about 20 seconds a day if they're lucky. So it takes quite a few days to clock up enough time to actually have a beer with them and a chat, as it were. So that doesn't happen very, very often. So this layered structure turns up all over the place when you look at it. These are some of our data that we've collated. Other people have collated similar data sets. One telephone data set from China, for example, shows exactly the same patterns. It appears on online gaming worlds, so these big, massive online gaming environments. You see exactly the same layers. These are an old Facebook data set. This is what's known as the New Orleans data set, which was released by Facebook before they realized that there was money in this stuff, I guess, but it's there and publicly available for people to use. This is a Twitter data set that my collaborators in Italy took down from Twitter. So these are the Twitterati talking to each other, if you like, posting to each other in named postings, named tweets, having conversations within Twitter accounts. Here's our cell phone database from the European data. Here's our face-to-face data from our British, and Belgian women's networks. And you can see how closely similar these figures are. And interestingly enough, these figures turn up in the distribution and the structure of primate social groups. So if you look at the sizes of social groups in primates, you tend to see these values occurring much more, or values in these kind of regions much more often than the values in between. And if you look at species like baboons and chimpanzees, for example, which live in these very large groups, typically on average about 50, then you see they have this layered structure as well with these kind of sizes. So this is something peculiar about these numbers that makes them extremely robust and resilient in the face of the many constraints that we operate under. So how do primates bond their social groups? Well, it's this two process mechanism. A key part of it is this activity here, social grooming, where they're leafing through the fur. That turns out to trigger the endorphin system in the brain. It's the hand actions across the fur and across the skin that's doing it. And that creates this, because endorphins are opiates, they're chemically related to morphine, but we don't get addicted to them because they're just chemically slightly different. But it gives us the same sense of relaxation and warmth and coziness and trust in the people that we're doing it with, and sets up a platform then for building friendships, which are then built cognitively using the brain. So this is where the kind of social brain component comes in, and the brain component then is used to build relationships of trust and obligation and reciprocity. And primates spend a huge amount, or at least the most social primates, can spend something in the order of a fifth of their entire day in this one activity. So it's clearly very important. Well, my collaborators in Finland have very kindly run some long-suffering participants through PET scanning, which is a fairly grim form of brain imaging, because it involves injecting radioactive dyes into you in order to see the brain in action. And here are their brains firing up in response to being stroked on the torso. So their partners were stroking them on the torso in the same kind of motion that grooming does. And you can see how grooming might be related to the things we do, or that are done to us when we go to the hairdresser, and maybe that's why we feel so relaxed after going to the hairdresser. But we kind of forget that actually we engage in a huge amount of social touch, constantly stroking and patting and hugging and so on all the time. And it's that deformation of the skin that's triggering the endorphin system. There's a very specialized neural system between the skin surface and the brain that makes that possible. And that neural system responds only to light, slow stroking at a rate of 3 centimeters a second. If you stroke faster than that or slower than that, it doesn't fire. It's the speed of hand movements during grooming in primates that it's responding to. So it's there with us. So time is very important on all this, because the quality and emotional intensity of those relationships that we have is directly related to how much time we invest in them in these kind of activities. And just as a reminder of that, here's some data from one of our longitudinal studies, where we're looking at the change in emotional closeness here over time, over the course of 18 months, when people moved away. So these are actually people, sixth formers at this stage in their last year at school, going away to university here, and their first year away at university. And 0 here is the point of no change across time. and their ratings of their emotional closeness to their extended family remains relatively constant, maybe even increases a bit when they move away. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, you might say, but their closeness to their original set of friends at the start of the study, so at sort of Easter time in their last year in the sixth form, last year at high school, just plummets, it drops away, and it drops away because they're not seeing them. So friendships are very fragile in that sense. They really require heavy investment. And just as a reminder of how much physical contact we actually do during the course of our conversations and interactions with our friends and family, these are data which, again, was done with our collaborators in Finland. We sampled a large number of people in Finland, Russia, Britain, France, Italy, and eventually Japan as well, and asked them where they felt comfortable being touched by other people, by specific people of a defined kind, obviously mother, father, for example, but also think of a particular auntie, think of a particular uncle, think of a particular acquaintance, and where are you happy to be touched by them, or for you to touch them? Where do you feel comfortable in that? The lighter the color, the more happy you are about it, the darker the red and especially the black, the less happy you are, or even if it's black, that's the sort of taboo zones, if you like. And you can see that this kind of physical contact component drops away slowly, really up to about cousins. And then after that, it really is quite minimal. It's hands only. Handshakes are all you're allowed to do, if you like. But certainly within this kind of magic circle, and this probably takes us out to about the 50 layer, there's a lot of physical contact that just goes on casually in the background that we probably don't really think about very much. So there is an issue here, because these kind of physical contact and grooming as used by primates is very limiting. That intimacy of it limits the size of groups that you can bond together. So, and that limit seems to be at about 50 individuals. That's what the primate data tell us. That's what the human physical contact data tell us. Yet we have groups of 150. So how have we managed that? And indeed, of course, beyond that. But you know, what have we done to bridge that gap? And it seems that we've introduced or latched onto a number of key things, behaviors that are largely cultural, and therefore learned, if you like, rather than genetically underpinned, that are deeply involved in our social interactions and also turn out to trigger the brain's endorphin system. The laughter is the one that is probably the most hardwired, and we share that with great apes. So it's probably relatively rather ancient. But singing and dancing, singing without words here, dancing, the rituals of religion, feasting, eating socially together, drinking alcohol specifically socially together, and storytelling, and particularly emotional storytelling, all trigger the endorphin system. Of course, these are kind of like our key social toolkit. So it looks like we've found these things which turn out to trigger the endorphin system, and we've grabbed them as ways of extending our grooming circles, because they allow us to groom many other people without having to physically touch them. We can groom at a distance, if you like. And this is how we've enabled ourselves to build up these much larger social networks. And of course, a lot of them extrapolate beyond the 150 quite well. So the rituals of religion seem to be particularly good at allowing very large numbers of individuals to be locked together in the same, of strangers essentially, to be locked together in the same community. But just to show you that they really do trigger the endorphin system, this is a set of experiments we did on laughter. So we're measuring pain thresholds, essentially, at how much pain can you stand in some way. We then show a video to make people laugh. We're just trying to get them to laugh. And then we retest their pain thresholds afterwards. And if pain threshold has increased over the course of the activity, then that means endorphins have been released, and increased your pain threshold. If there's no change in pain threshold, then there's been no endorphins activated. So this is the change in pain threshold from before to after. Here's 0, no change. This is negative change. This is positive change. So anything up here, endorphins have been released essentially. And then what we do is we show them a comedy video, something like Michael McIntyre, just from one of their DVDs, 15 minutes usually. And then a control group, we want something that nobody will laugh at. So we found very good videos for this is golfing instruction videos, because for reasons which I don't understand, nobody laughs at golfing instruction videos. Perfect. So here's our 5 experiments, or 5 of our experiments that on this thing. They're all using different groups of people and different videos. And you can see that the black dots here, which are the experimental group who are watching comedy and who therefore laugh, all show in general an increase in pain threshold, whereas those watching the neutral videos and don't laugh either show no change or a negative change. So it's a very strong effect of the endorphin system. We actually did this live at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. They were watching live stand-up comedy. They were watching some sort of little drama events. And then our collaborators in Finland have done the neuroimaging for this, the PET scanning, and shown that after laughter, the brain is just firing up. The endorphin receptors in the brain are just going crazy with the endorphins that are being pumped out. And just to spread that picture a little bit more widely and also relate it to bonding, this is a measure of how bonded you feel to the group. Here's 0 again. So this is compilation of all our singing experiments, dance experiments on dance, religious rituals. So these are mostly church rituals. We actually know they're Christian ones and Brazilian Afro-Caribbean churches or church, as well as emotional storytelling. And you can see the black bars are the actual activity, the gray bars are the control, where they're doing something else. So in the case of singing, they were doing hobby craft type activities. And these are the equivalent data in terms of pain threshold changes for the laughter experiments and for the dance experiments. And this is an experimental intervention which we're giving people instead of here. The control is just very low-key body movements as opposed to full body dancing. But here we're giving them naltrexone, which is an endorphin blocker. It blocks up the receptor sites in the brain, and you don't get the hit. So it's experimental proof that it's naltrexone that's doing it. So these activities really do kick in the endorphin system, and they make us feel very bonded. So the question is, who makes a good friend out of all this? Well, the answer is very simple. It's homophily, 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 for better or for worse. Because this is, if you like, you can see immediately why echo chambers occur. So on the one hand, this is how you make really the best friends, but on the other hand, there's a cost to it in terms that it leaves us very prone to echo chamber effects. So homophily simply means you prefer people who are very similar to yourself. Some of these traits that turn out to characterize our friendship circles are endogenous and some are exogenous, and that's quite interesting itself. The endogenous traits are really gender. There's a huge gender bias on the sex of the other members of your social network. So for women, and these are our women's networks in particular, 75% of people in the network will be females and only 25% males. And when you look at males networks, you see that exactly the reverse. 75% are men, only 25% are women. Predominantly, most of these minority groups will be members of your extended family, over whom I guess you have no choice. So you have to kind of include them if you like. your friends are predominantly same sex as you. And these proportions remain extraordinarily stable across the lifespan. They've been sampled by different studies from the children at age 5 right the way through to 85-year-olds. And the number just doesn't budge. It's very, very constant. Age, ethnicity, personality, especially for extroverts. Extroverts prefer extroverts, introverts prefer introverts. I just show you the effect of age. This is based on a stratified UK national survey, who is, done by a polling organization for us. And you can see 20-year-olds have, something in the order of 300 friends on the whole, drops away very steadily as you get older and falls off dramatically, in fact, after the age of about 65, 70. But what seems to happen is 20-year-olds maximize the number of people they're contacting with. I think they're kind of acting like careful shoppers. They're kind of checking out all the local supermarkets to see where the best deal is, who would make the best friends. And then from about 30 onwards, it kind of stabilizes around about 150 and then starts to fall again as you get into old age. But that increase in loneliness that occurs as a result of this in old age is what seems to underpin poor health and poor health prognoses in that older age group. The exogenous traits are kind of in many ways the really interesting one, because these are all cultural things. So it turned out that there seem to be about 7 dimensions involved in the traits that we kind of like, if you like, or match our friends on. So these data are actually done by saying, think of somebody in this social circle, either male or female, separately, that is. So we had them do a male friend and a female friend from the 15 circle, and a male friend and a female friend from the 50 circle, and so on. And then in addition, they did the same for all their family members. And they were rating them for a large number of things, which we thought might be interesting. And then when we put all these different, it's a bit like sort of personality inventory, if you like, we put all the different traits that we'd offered them together, it turned out that there were probably about 7 main dimensions, which we came to call the 7 pillars of friendship. So they are having the same language, or better still, dialect. And remember, the social linguists told us in the 1970s that you could place a native English speaker to within 25 miles of their birthplace by their dialect. It is so small a community that has a very, very specific dialect. And we actually ran a study some years ago on Glasgow. So it was done by one of our graduate students who came from Glasgow and had a Glaswegian accent from a particular part of Glasgow. I forget which now. And he tested whether or not people from different parts of Glasgow would do him a favor. I rang them up and asked them if they do the favor. All he was interested in was whether they're going to say yes or no. And what he showed very nicely, we never published this, but I thought it really demonstrated very nicely, is that people that came from his specific home corner of Glasgow were much, much more likely, as soon as they heard his accent, to say, okay, yes, I'll help you out here. He was going to, ostensibly, he was going to ask them a whole lot of questions for a questionnaire, but in fact, all he was interested in was that, yes or no. But people from elsewhere in Glasgow, they're much less willing, if you like. So something about your local dialect that makes it different. It identifies where you grew up, if you like, coming from specifically from the same place. And I think it's growing up in that area is important. Is a second one. It's knowing the same streets, knowing the same pubs, knowing the same cafes. These kind of things. It's kind of identifying the community, and that you're a member of that community. You think like people in that community think. Having the same educational trajectory, which might be going to the same university, it might be the same course, but I think that underpins why medics typically have medics as friends, and why lawyers typically have lawyers as friends, more than you'd expect, much more than you'd expect, some would say. Having the same hobbies and interests, having the same worldview, which is a sort of composite of moral views, religious views, and political views. And then the two interesting ones, having the same musical taste and having the same sense of humor. And these appear to be particularly strong, although there appear to be, these kind of are interchangeable in many ways. We seem to place a lot of stress on musical taste, particularly with respect to strangers. If we meet a stranger who turns out to like the same music as we do, or the same group, suddenly that has the basis for a potential friendship in a way that doesn't happen otherwise. And similarly, having the same sense of humor. And then what's plotted here is the level of emotional closeness, the rated level of emotional closeness to the specific people that they were, that our participants here were rating on these various traits, according to the number of these dimensions that they shared in common. So people with whom they shared 5 or 6 traits, they felt much more emotionally close to than people who they shared relatively few of these traits with. So something about these cultural elements which seems to be important in identifying, and I think what it's actually doing is identifying a community of origin. So it's a kind of way is the community you grew up in, where you learned how to be a member of that community. You learned how to see the world, how to behave towards others. And I think what it is a shortcut to really not having to work so hard at building up a relationship. So you know, if somebody shares a lot of these traits with you, they're going to make a good friend. You don't really need to ask any further. These, of course, change through lifetime somewhat. So there's a kind of tracking that goes on with the groups you move through during the course of your life. But what's also interesting is they undermine, in some sense, some of the endogenous traits that underpin homophily. So they kind of will wipe out the ethnicity effect. They will wipe out the gender effect quite explicitly, and to some extent the age effect as well. So you know, what these really look like is sort of distant and close up traits. So you you spot somebody on the other side of the room, and you go on the sort of superficial appearances, as it were, as to decide whether or not they might make a good friend. And once you get to know them, what you're working on is these close-up things of these cultural elements, which then kind of make the distance cues rather more irrelevant. Okay, so just to sum up, really, Dunbar's number is the size of our social world. It is extremely small. The size is determined by our brain. Our social networks are highly structured and they're highly homophilous. The structure is determined mainly by how we allocate time so as to maximize the benefits we get from the various types of friendships we have, or relationships we have there. And the friendships really, all these relationships, both family and friendship relationships, are underpinned by this dual process mechanism, which heavily rests on the endorphin system, as well as the sort of cognitive processes that we engage in. So I will stop there and unshare myself, and we can perhaps do some questions.
Thank you, Professor Dunbar, for this very interesting talk. And indeed, if anybody has questions, please write it in the chat or in Q&A. So I noticed that there is one question already from Lawrence. Lawrence asks, for lonely individuals who have relatively limited social networks, what methods are most effective in helping them grow their network? Should they be interested in doing so?
That's a very interesting question, actually, and one we've puzzled about for a long time, not least because it's kind of the sort of thing people immediately springs to mind. You know, okay, we understand how these things work. So if you're kind of isolated, if you're shy, if for whatever reasons, or you move to a new community, how do what do you do about building a social network? And we know this is a problem because we've actually looked at immigrants' networks in Spain with my Spanish collaborators, and shown that because they don't have the contacts, they're not well embedded yet into a community. And these, I hasten to add, these are not recent immigrants. These were all immigrant communities that had been established in Spain for some considerable time. That they don't have the linkages that are wide enough to provide this kind of layered structure. They have a kind of reverse structure with many more people in their inner core and few people in their outer core. So there are these constraints that operate, and I think those are the same constraints in the case of immigrants that operate with people who move to a new area, who've been out of circulation for a while, perhaps because of illness or whatever. The question is then, what do you do about it? And the answer we keep coming back to is actually, you've got to join those kind of activities that give you access to other people. Now, if you're religiously minded, there is an obvious one. It's called a church or a mosque or a temple or whatever your particular religion might be. That gives you access to a pool of people who are going to be relatively well disposed to you. If you're not religiously oriented, then what do you do? My best bet is singing. Join some sort of singing group, not necessarily a professional choir. It's just round the kind of campfire type singing is what you're looking for, a kind of Gareth Malone type stuff, a military wives type choir, because singing just is instantaneous. We refer to it as the icebreaker effect. If you sing with people for an hour, as you might do in an evening, as it were, it can turn complete strangers, literally complete strangers, into people who think they've been lifelong friends. It's absolutely magical, and that's much the quickest way of doing it. So I strongly recommend, whether you think you can sing or not, doesn't really matter. Don't go and join a professional choir, that's all I say. Go to a nice, comfy amateur community one, and who are just there to kind of enjoy the singing, and it will produce friendships very quickly. So that would be my best bet. But any kind of club that is social by its nature, and therefore, either has drinks or coffee or something, or sandwiches before or afterwards, is the kind of place you want to look for.
Thank you for that answer. We have a few more questions. I'll try to squeeze one more, if that is okay.
Yep.
So actually there are two that are quite related. Both are related with personality traits, from Claire and Poppy. So they ask, are there personality traits that make people more likely to seek out friends or partners who are different in some way? That's the one question. And the other one, which I think is related, is from Poppy, and she asks whether the Dunbar's number is affected by being an introvert versus an extrovert.
Okay, I'll take Poppy's question first, maybe, because that's the quickest to answer. The answer is yes. Extroverts have bigger social networks than introverts. They don't have necessarily differ in the size of the inner layers. It's the outer layers of the network that they differ. So they both have the same 5 and 15 layers, typically, but introverts will have a smaller 50 and a smaller 150. And the difference, we think, is in how risky the two types of personalities are prepared, or risks that they're prepared to take. Introverts want to be sure their friends work, so they take what social capital they have, and they both have the same amount of social capital to spend, the amount of time in the day, or emotional capital, but introverts want to ladle that more thickly on a few friends to make sure those friends are really reliable. So when they ask them to do them a favor, they'll say yes without question. Whereas extroverts seem to be more willing to spread their social capital more thinly among more people, particularly in those outer reaches. So it looks like they're kind of trying to widen their community, outer layers of their community contacts, in order to be able to perhaps access more opportunities. But they pay a price for that, because they're average emotional closeness of their friendships within their whole 150, give or take, is much lower than is the case for introverts. So introverts have much stronger, if you like, warmer relationships on average across the whole network. Extroverts have much cooler, shallower relationships, but that's because they're trying to do two different things. Now, one isn't better than the other, just two different ways of solving the same problem. And it's dependent really on how risky you're prepared to face the world. So basically what extroverts are doing is kind of trading on their social confidence to kind of not be put off by the fact that when you ask Jennifer to help you out, she says, sorry, I'm too busy. And an extrovert will just shrug their shoulders and say, oh, well, I'll go and ask Penelope. It doesn't matter too much. Whereas an introvert kind of goes, oh no, Jennifer was my best friend. She's just abandoned me. So it's just two different ways of coping with the complexity of the social world, we think, anyway. The homophily issue with regard to romantic relationships is kind of interesting, actually. It does seem that romantic relationships which are more similar actually last longer. The urban folktale, if you like, is opposites attract, and yes, they do up to a point, but it seems like only certain kinds of opposites will attract. So, you know, because the problem you have with personalities, obviously with personality, you've got one who's outgoing and the other who is more introverted and more ingoing, then you're going to have constant clashes on Saturday night because the extrovert wants to go clubbing and the introvert wants to get a TV dinner in and sit and watch a film, right? Now, you've got to come to some compromise and you've got to be very tolerant both ways to make that work. So it's just the fractiousness that's going to naturally occur in disputes, if you like, over what we should do on a particular day. Should we go and visit this relative or not? Who should we spend Christmas with, your parents or my parents? All these kind of disputes are just easier if everybody agrees, or if one of the member of the couple is just prepared to say, fine, you know, we'll do whatever you want to do and I'm not going to be grumpy about it. And that you know, clearly happens because some people are willing to be very tolerant in that sense. So, you know, opposites require much greater tolerance on the part of at least one, but they work better if both are tolerant. So, you know, there's, you know, at the end of the day, I actually don't think ethnicity matters that much. It gets swept away under the carpet by all the cultural similarities. Do you have the same sense of humor? Do you like the same kind of music? These kinds of things are much more important in making a relationship work once you're in close up, if you like, and particularly for those kind of relationships. So I really don't think the ethnicity effects carry much weight. They're just markers for probable membership of the same cultural group. And once you establish that actually you are part of my cultural group, then everything works just fine, and ethnicity becomes much less important. So yeah, and I kind of say this because that's the environment I grew up in. I grew up in East Africa, and I'm bilingual in Swahili and English, so and completely bilingual in Swahili and English. And you know, these were just the kind of cultural environments you kind of didn't notice really that much. If you're embedded in the culture, you just swim through it.
Okay, thank you so much. If I can just squeeze one last question, because Adnan asked it twice, and he asked about the effect of parents on the friendship. So I guess how I interpret the question, that maybe there is some genetic variability, behavioral genetics, maybe behind the number of friends that people have. Is there any research that you are aware of, or maybe it's upbringing, nature versus nurture? I don't know, but is there any relationship or any study that looked at this, like how many friends parents have and how many children. Is there some correlation?
Okay, it's very clear to us now, at least, that what's really important about mastering these social skills that allow us to live in this very complicated social world. I actually think the human social world is the most complicated thing in the universe because it's constantly in dynamic turnover. Our friendships are not static, and our friends keep falling out with each other. And we have to make judgments. Who do we go with? Who do we offend? All these kind of things. It's really very complicated, and it is important that you have a big computer. So this is the brain size effect, but that alone does not allow you to live in that world, because you can't have something that's genetically determined that is flexible enough to cope with that kind of complexity. So learning it has a huge effect on our acquisition of the skills needed. They're the skills of diplomacy, basically. And we have to learn those in the sandpit of life. There's no other way of doing it. We learn by practice, and we learn by observation, and we learn by cultural transmission and by teaching. Which effectively is, I always describe it as putting the software into the computer. You can have a big computer, that's fine, but you need the software in it. Development allows you to do that, and that takes a very long time in primates. Primates are the only species, aside perhaps from elephants, who have a true adolescence during which they're learning these skills, and it's very long in humans. All the neuroimaging data, all the brain development data, all the social and cognitive development data suggests that it takes humans about 25 years, the first 25 years of life, to become modestly competent as adults. And none of us are very competent, I should point out. To develop the skills needed takes a lot of practice. So, there is lots of scope there for parents to be involved. Of course, there is a genetic component to that, but as with most things in biology, nothing is wholly genes and nothing is wholly environmental. It's this mix of the two. What's really important, I think, in terms of learning these skills is not your parents, it's the children you mix with, right? It's a peer effect rather than, because you're practicing the details of these behaviors and decision-making processes with the same group of people that you're going to live as your peers throughout life, that age cohort you're in. And parents play much less important role, I suspect, than they would wish. I mean, there are things that parents impose, which is kind of, if you like, discipline. There are things you must not do. You must share your toys with these other children and those kind of things. But actually, the skills are learned from our peers. That said, there are things we learn from the wider community, including our parents, and that are things like religion. Your religion is really heavily inherited from your home, parental and home environment. It's much more strongly inherited than anything genetic. I think the heritability of religion is something like 70 or 75%, whereas, for example, your stature is only 20% heritable genetically. So some of these cultural things which establish the community you belong to do have high heritabilities. But so they're the signals, if you like it, but the details of how to manage and cope with this social complexity, I think we have to learn from each other predominantly, because we spend most of our time as children with other children rather than with adults. Or at least we used to, when everybody had big families. But now we recreate big families in the school playground. So, you still spend most of your time as a child outside lockdowns, of course, interacting with other children. For those of you old enough to have teenage children will know that one thing teenage children do not want to do is to do things with their parents. They want to do things with their peers, their friends. So yes, parents have some effect, but other children have a much, much bigger effect, I think.
So peer effects are important. That's a very important, I think, think about, and like the whole talk. Thank you for this very insightful talk. And I can see from the chat that there are many people who wrote similar messages, and I apologize for all those who asked questions. I think that we extend the talk already quite a bit, and thank you, Professor Dunbar, for giving us your time. This was a really amazing talk. It was an honor to have you here. And for those who joined later, please be aware that there is a recorded video of this talk, so others will be able to see it later on from the beginning. So
well, you're very welcome. And if anybody wants to follow up with and ask their questions, which we never got down to mentioning, please just email me and I'll reply.
You may get a lot of emails. There is a lot of audience, yeah, over 80 people, but yeah, maybe a new friendship will emerge from it. So who knows? Okay, thank you very much once again, and thank you to the audience, and I wish you a nice evening.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.